Well, it falls to me to say what it is that our Purpose Prize winners exemplify psychologically, and by talking about what they exemplify, to give advice to the rest of us about our future. I want to talk about what's known about the seventh decade and beyond psychologically and how to flourish. Can you hear me? Can you hear me back? Good. Well, my story begins in Penn Station about 6 months ago, and I was on a train waiting to go home from New York, and I saw this 90-year-old man, bent in half from osteoporosis, walking down the aisle, almost falling. Do I need this? Oh, okay. Do I need to start again? And I caught him as he was falling and took him to the seat next to me, and it turned out to be my mentor, Albert Stunkard, Mickey Stunkard, a 90-year-old professor of psychiatry. And as I sat him down and we began to go to Philadelphia, I asked, Mickey, what were you doing up here? And he said, oh, I just gave the 65th anniversary commencement address to my medical school class. And I said, well, what did you talk about, Mickey? Mickey's had a wonderful life, the dean of psychiatry in America. And he said, oh, I talked about this new theory of binge eating and a new theory of treatment because I want everyone to start using it. This is the lesson of our Purpose Prize winners. The one thing we know about longevity, about health, and about flourishing in the last quarter of life, which most of us here are in. And it is in one word, one phrase, to live in the future, not in the past and not in the present. So I want to tell you what I mean by that, what the scientific data are about that, and then in this way to congratulate our Purpose Prize winners for exemplifying living in the future as well as any group of over 65s I know. So if I put this down and use this, it will still work? Okay. Well, where I come from scientifically, about 45 years ago, I was interested in helplessness and who gave up and collapsed when rejection, uncontrollable events, failure occurred. And we did a lot of laboratory experiments with people and animals, and we generally found that when people and animals in the laboratory were exposed to events they couldn't do anything about, they became passive, they became sad, they were cognitively impaired, they showed all the symptoms of depression. One thing I neglected in the first 10 years of research on this was the fact that 1/3 of the people we brought to the laboratory, 1/3 of the animals, never became helpless. We couldn't make them helpless. So we asked the question, what is it about some people that makes them stand up, come back, and resist helplessness in spite of failure? And it turned out to be what we called learned optimism. Simple concept, not the glass half full versus half empty, but ask yourself, when you think about a bad event that's occurred to you, what do you think causes it? And we found that the people who said it's permanent, it's unchangeable, it's going to undermine everything I do, were the people who became helpless very easily, and people who had the habit of mind of saying, it's temporary, it's changeable, and it's just this one situation, were the people who never became helpless. And it was that that led to the field of positive psychology. Positive psychology asks the question, what makes life worth living? It asks not about human weakness, but about human strength. And in my thinking about positive psychology, and this is what I think our Purpose Prize winners identify, I use the acronym PERMA, P-E-R-M-A. Positive psychology is about 5 different domains: how to build them in children, how to build them in adults, and how for our group to live them over the age of 65. The first is positive emotion. The second is engagement, when you're totally absorbed in flow. As I look around, about 70% of you look to me like you're totally absorbed in what I'm saying. We found the other 30% of you are having sexual fantasies, by the way. So the second thing we investigate is engagement, when you're one with the music. The third thing we investigate is positive relationships, the R. The fourth is meaning, and the fifth is accomplishment. And in the 10 minutes I have, I just want to take one example particularly relevant to the group of us who have assembled in this room today, and that's the question of optimism and what it predicts about life after 65. So I've gotten interested in the question of positive physical health. The story of this is positive psychology claimed that mental health was something real, over and above the absence of mental illness. It was the presence of PERMA. So the question the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and my colleagues are asking is physical health a real thing? That is it the presence of something? And what I want to talk about today, it is actually the presence of three kinds of things in your life. I'm going to call them health assets. Just going to talk about one of them. The first of these is subjective health assets. And the one I'm going to talk about is optimism, the belief that bad events are temporary, that you can change them, and that they're local. That's an example of a health asset on the subjective side. The second kind of health asset we look at, we're not going to talk about today, is physical health assets. Things like heart rate variability, oxytocin, and the like. And the third is functional health assets, good marriage, loving your work. Now, what positive health asks is different from what's been asked in the past. If you look at people who try to predict the age at which you're going to die, your morbidity, healthcare expenditure, your quality of life, the field has looked at risk factors, high blood pressure, divorce, and the like. What we do is we hold risk factors constant, and we ask the question, are there positive things that lengthen life, that decrease morbidity, that decrease healthcare expenditure, that increase the quality of life? So this is the question of what, over and above the disabling conditions of life, brings about positive health. And the one I'm going to talk about just for 3 minutes now is one that there's now consensus about, and that's the effect of optimism on cardiovascular death and disease in a group like us. And I'll talk about 3 kinds of studies that have been done. 6 years ago, a Dutch group led by Professor Giltay took 1,000 Dutch people, age 65 and over. They measured blood pressure, cholesterol, health, depression, smoking, alcohol, all the risk factors, and they asked the question, can we predict who's going to live and who's going to die from risk factors? They waited for 10 years, and 350 of the people died of cardiovascular death. And they found that none of the traditional risk factors were predictive. What predicted who resisted cardiovascular death was optimism. Questions at age 65, ask yourself these questions as I say them. I still expect a great deal from life. I'm full of plans. So people, 65 to 85-year-old people who endorsed that were had a 23% death rate relative to the rest of the population. Interestingly, it was not good cheer. So people who laughed a lot, who were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, showed no difference. It was the people who had hope for the future in their lives. Second study, 97,000 American women followed for 10 years. They take an instrument, measures optimism, called the LOT. The LOT is an optimism test which asks you, when things are unclear, I usually expect the best. So they asked the question, over the next 10 years, what was the cardiovascular death rate among these women? And the women who had high optimism, again, holding constant all the traditional risk factors, blood pressure, cholesterol, BMI, alcohol, smoking, had 30% fewer cardiovascular deaths. There are 3 Japanese studies very much to the point of why we're honoring the Purpose Prize winners. Are any of you speakers of Japanese? Oh, good, then you can't correct me about what I'm about to say. There's a Japanese concept which I'll pronounce as ikigai, I-K-I-G-A-I, which means having a purpose for life, having a purpose for your future. And there is a Japanese questionnaire about it. It is ikigai, to my way of thinking, is a combination of optimism and, on the PERMA notion, a combination of meaning. So there are 3 studies that looked over time at the mortality of people with high ikigai and low ikigai over a decade, looking at stroke, cardiovascular disease. And people with low ikigai, people who have no sense of purpose for their future, had 160% more cardiovascular and stroke deaths. Okay, so I want to underline this. One thing we know about health assets is that those people who live in the future, those people like Mickey Stunkard, whose commencement address at age 65 is not about the past, it's about what medicine should do in the future. Those of you in the speeches I just heard here, every one of those was living in the future, that we know that you have between 30 and 50% lower risk for cardiovascular mortality, holding constant all traditional risk factors. Now, we don't know why this occurs. It seems to be a naked scientific fact. The possibilities are optimistic people actually have fewer bad events occur to them than pessimistic people. So pessimistic people, when there's a tornado warning, don't go into shelters. They think it's God's will. Optimistic people say there's something I can do about it. When the Surgeon General's report on smoking came out 40 years ago, it was the optimists who gave up smoking and not the pessimists. So the first reason that optimism may help you is that optimists believe they can do something and they act. The second reason may be social. I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you have at least one person in your life that you would be comfortable calling at 3 in the morning to tell your troubles to? Raise your hand if that's so. Okay. Almost everyone in the room. It turns out your risk for cardiovascular death is markedly lower. That is, people who have high, intimate social support have better health, holding other risk factors constant. It turns out that while misery loves company, company does not love misery. People like optimistic people better. The third possible factor is biological. So my friend and colleague Judy Roden, who was my president later on, and I were interested in following immune system as a function of optimism and pessimism. And at age 65 to 85, optimists holding constant physical health and depression have feistier immune systems. So let me summarize what I've said today. I've said that the advice that Mickey Stunkard gives us, the advice that Positive Health gives us, is from age 65 to 85, there are 5 things to cultivate in your life. It's what I call PERMA. More positive emotion, including crucially optimism, more engagement in what you do, enriching the relationships you have with other people, having meaning, purpose, ikigai in your life, and having accomplishment. And as I read the biographies of the Purpose Prize winners, I don't think there's a group in the nation of people who exemplify PERMA, flourishing, and optimism more than these heroes. So I thank you for being allowed to congratulate our Purpose Prize winners.